This meeting is being recorded.
Great. So thank you all again for being here with us. My name is Eric Hamilton. I'm a program officer with New Borders, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. I want to introduce our speakers for today and quickly go over the agenda for the call. So please welcome the COO of New Borders, Tim Gilday.
Hello, everyone.
Investigative subject matter expert, Michael Ronayne.
Good afternoon.
Senior BITE team member, Ann Riitho.
Hello.
And our special guest speaker, Customs and Trade Attorney with Harris Bricken, Bob Kossick.
Hello, everybody.
Okay, so for today's agenda, we'll start with a presentation from Bob on forced labor policies and the compliance burden for the trade community. We'll then hand it over to Tim and Ann to show how BITE can assist the trade community with their compliance, as well as review our analysis of the Chenguang Biotech Group. Ann will then present a few of the product updates that have been made to BITE over the past month, followed by an enforcement roundup from Mike. We'll end the conversation with a Q&A, so feel free again to send any questions you have to me in the chat. But before we move on to our speakers, I do want to talk a little bit about New Borders and the BITE platform. At New Borders, we do two things. We have a back-end AI-based data platform with hundreds of millions of records that informs our analysis and drives our compliance and risk management tools. We take the output of the AI model, consolidate the larger list of compliance data, and make it all available to the public through a very easy-to-use web app. The web app, known as BITE, offers a cost-effective toolbox for trade and transaction compliance. We provide a low-cost, efficient way for customers to mitigate their trade risk. Tim and Ann will go into more detail about BITE and its benefits later on in the call. Now with that, I'm very excited to turn the conversation to Bob, so feel free to unmute and take over.
Okay, you can hear me, right, Tim? I don't think I'm muted, right? Okay. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, as the case might be. I'm talking to you from Seattle, Washington. Thank you to the New Borders group and the BITE team for having me on here. It's an honor and it's a privilege to be with you. My remarks this morning are going to focus on three basic parts. One is a quick review, a high-level review of the regulatory framework that applies to forced labor. The second part will be a quick review of some of the due diligence measures that can be taken to address in advance forced labor issues. And then finally, wrapping up with some big picture considerations some developments I think that importers should keep their eye on in the context of forced labor. So with that, let's start with a quick look at the framework of U.S. laws and regulations that are focused on the intersection of forced labor and trade. This is not a new concept. It goes actually back to the 1890s when there was when the United States government put a law on the books that prohibited the importation of goods made with convict labor. That law morphed and was expanded under the Tariff Act of 1930. Section 307, also today referred to as 19 U.S.C. 1307. That law took the concept from the 1890s, expanded it by prohibiting the importation of goods mined, produced, manufactured in whole or part with convict or forced labor. That was later amended to include child labor, to bring child labor within that scope. Regulations to govern the application of Section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930 were developed in the 60s. This is 19 CFR 12.42 to 12.45. And these regulations set up, basically, I'm simplifying here, but set up a system of WROs and findings, withhold release orders and findings. With withhold release orders, WROs, these are issued on the basis of reasonable evidence, which follows CBP's conduction of a prior investigation. The outcomes on a WRO can be either a detention, and the options available to an importer would be to challenge that WRO, which can be done, or to export in the event they feel they can't overcome the issue. Findings, on the other hand, follow from a determination from CBP of forced labor. That opens the door to seizure. These can also be challenged with satisfactory and conclusive or conclusive evidence. Between the 1930s and the 1980s, there was not a lot of enforcement activity for Section 307 of the Tariff Act. Based on a little bit of research that I did, it looks like there were about approximately 75 instances where a party came to the U.S. government seeking enforcement of forced labor enforcement flowing from Section 307. And it was used to deny entry to merchandise. And approximately, I've seen anywhere between 8 to 10 instances. So that's not a high level of activity there. Use of Section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930 picked up between 1980 and 2015 a little bit. During that time period, you do see 22 WROs being issued and 6 findings. I wouldn't call that a huge volume of activity, enforcement activity. And there are a couple of reasons why that level is low. For one, there was at that time, going back to the 1930s, there was a clause built into the law called the consumptive demand clause, which made it such that if the United States concluded that there was a need or demand, that the availability of that product couldn't be satisfied, but for the allowing of the importation of those goods, it would be allowed. There was also a lack of reliable information available. This was pre-internet times for the most part, and we didn't have the stream of information that we had today. And finally, then, as is now, there was some concern about the sufficiency of the human resources available to drill down on these instances when they came up. That was again the case then, and it still continues to be the case. CBP's hands are a little bit tied by, a lack of human resources or insufficient amount of human resources. The situation changed in 2015, 2016 with the passage of the TFTA, the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Agreement. That repealed the consumptive demand clause, and that opened up the doors to more enforcement activity because that clause was no longer in place. Since that time, you've seen 30 new WROs at the company, at the region, and at the activity level. Activity referring specifically to some of the activities taking place with respect to fishing vessels. There have also been 2 new findings. The majority of this activity, starting in 2015, 2016, not surprisingly, has focused on China. 2017 marks the beginning of a slightly new approach. What you see in 2017, new approach in terms of enforcing Section 307, just to be clear. What you see there is the CATSA, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Trade Sanctions Act, which was targeted specifically at North Korea. And what was new and interesting about that was, one, it had a country specific focus, one. 2, it went beyond the forced labor provisions of the Tariff Act and the regulations by creating a presumption of forced labor that could be rebutted. And in order to do that, it created a standard, which was basically clear and convincing evidence. You could rebut that presumption of forced labor, but you had to do so through the presentation of clear and convincing evidence. The CATSA from 2017 then served as a model for what followed, which brings us full circle to kind of where we are today in the United States, with the introduction of the UFLPA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. In 2021, it was passed. In 2022, it went into effect. That law, as we are all quite familiar with, takes a regional and an entity focus. It also, like the CATSA, creates a presumption of forced labor. It created 2 challenge pathways. One was basically to argue that your goods are out of scope, and the other pathway is to argue that your goods are in scope, or to acknowledge that your goods are in scope, but to claim that you fall within an exception, which is a little bit more of a complicated procedure. And with respect to that second pathway, it opened the door also to, well, it requires, you can challenge it, but you need to do so using clear and convincing evidence again, as was the case with CATSA. Importers have a short period of time to demonstrate the absence of forced labor. In the event that their goods are detained under the UFLPA, is 30 days on the books. That can be extended up to 2 times. And if those efforts, if an effort to challenge UFLPA detention are unsuccessful, an importer is left with the option of exporting the goods at their own cost or potentially facing a seizure. CBP decisions with respect to UFLPA matters can be subject to protest for exclusions. I'm sorry, to the petitioning, to the submission of a petition in the case of a seizure. In terms of forced labor enforcement activity under the UFLPA, what we're seeing today, you're seeing generally rising levels of enforcement since the law went into effect in June of 2022. So far, and CBP's got a pretty decent statistical dashboard available on their webpage. We've seen approximately 5,000 shipments detained with a value in excess of $1.7 billion. The most heavily targeted industries for UFLPA detentions have involved electronics. They represent 44% of all detentions. Industrial manufacturing materials, they represent about 18% of all detentions so far. Apparel, footwear, textiles, they represent approximately 17% of all detentions. And agricultural and prepared products, approximately 6% of all detentions to date. So that's the high speed, high level, quick review of the regulatory framework and kind of just give you a sense of where enforcement activity has been. Let me shift now to a few considerations which will be of benefit to importers when it comes to mitigating UFLPA risk. This is UFLPA specific. There are a number of steps and measures that can and should be taken by an importer. And these are pretty well fleshed out in by a number of sources, governmental sources. There are a number of government guidance, strategy, FAQ, dashboard, application, and list resources which are available. These are put out by CBP, the FLEDF, the Department of Labor, the Department of State. There are IGO resources through the ILO, the International Labor Organization's indicators. That's an important resource. And then finally, there are a number of NGO reports too, which are very important to keep your eye on when you're thinking about resources that can help you mitigate forced labor risk. In terms of due diligence steps that an importer could and should be taking if they're importing things into the United States, and it's not just about China, even though the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act focuses on the Uyghur region and defined entities. It is possible for materials that originated in that region or through companies that are operating there to find their way into finished goods, which quote unquote originate in other places like Indonesia or Malaysia. So there are a number of due diligence steps that should be taken. We're going to walk you through some of these real quickly. These are examples. I'm not holding this out as comprehensive, but it gives you a good sense of the things that you want to be thinking about and doing. One, you want to review the resources, which I just mentioned above, the governmental, the IGO, and the NGO resources. Two, ideally, if you can, the importer should conduct a verification visit to the facility or the factory of its manufacturer or its producer or the supplier abroad. Three, an importer should make sure that they have a robust set of transactional documents. These documents should include forced labor terms and all the relevant agreements. We always use a forced labor questionnaire, which we request that a supplier or producer fill out and submit. We request bills of material to get a better insight into where the different parts and components and sub-assemblies that go into finished goods are coming from within that supply chain, as well as information about who produced those and where they're from, but paying particular attention to postal codes. And we also request certifications of no forced labor from the supplier or producer in conjunction with the delivery of the goods. Then we usually request and make a part of any kind of a contract manufacturing agreement or purchase agreement access to operational documents, for example, employee recruiting, wage reports, production records, transportation records and logs, things of that nature. Another step that can be taken is the conduction of third-party verifications. Those are becoming more complicated for reasons which we'll discuss in a moment. We screen the UFLPA entity list. For example, like what you're going to see in the demonstration or in the case study that's coming up. There are supply chain mapping measures that can and should be taken. I think this is probably the most important thing that you can do. And when you do this, the goal is to gain visibility from what is referred to as the cradle to the grave, or the nth tier. You want to ideally see every node, every entity in the nodes up that supply chain. Another due diligence measure is the development and implementation of forced labor oriented internal controls, policies, procedures, training. Make sure your people who are working in your organization understand what this is and where the risks can arise. Make sure you have audit procedures in place with respect to your supplier, with respect to your own practices, et cetera. And then finally, engagement with the CEEs, the Centers of Excellence and Expertise. If and when there are doubts, those are important resources for U.S. importers. Those are usually keyed to the harmonized tariff schedule code of the products you import. You should know your C, and you should understand that if you have questions about forced labor, they're there. You can get with them to get guidance. The ultimate goal here is to have this information lined up in advance on the front end. You don't want to have to be going through this list of due diligence measures and actions on the back end after a detention has occurred. Given the short period of time frame, which we talked about before, even if it's extendable once or twice, it's still not a lot of time to get these documents lined up. This is a classic case of where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So let me close my remarks with the identification of a few developments that I think are worth watching and keeping your eye on if you're an importer. The first one is the issue of foreign supplier cooperation. This, in our experience, has always been variable. To some extent, it's a function of how big a fish you are. Big fish, small fish, you are going to have more leverage to get cooperation and support and information insight from your overseas supplier or manufacturer. And I've seen that be really good depending on the motivation of the overseas supplier, and I've seen it be really bad. So don't assume that getting the cooperation you're going to need is going to be easy. The other thing is, at this point, a lot of overseas, particularly in China, suppliers, producers, exporters are between a rock and a hard place, in the sense that even if they want to cooperate, it might be the case that there are countervailing pressures from the Chinese government in the form of anti-foreign sanction laws, blocking statutes, espionage concerns, which have the effect of chilling the level of cooperation you might get. So keep that in mind. This also goes to, we alluded to before, with the third-party verifications. There's been a lot of negative publicity in the press the last couple of months regarding the way that the Chinese government has engaged with and treated some foreign auditing consulting outfits which do this type of work. So, you know, it's great in theory to think that you'll get a third-party verification, but in practice, it might be more difficult. Two is keep your eye on what's happening in Congress, the Congressional Executive Committee on China, the House Select Committee on U.S.-China Competition. There is something of a sense of impatience in Congress about the robusticity and the pace at which progress is being made in curtailing forced labor. There has been pressure to expand the entity list. You always want to keep your eye on the entity list. There has been debate on ongoing debate in Congress about shutting down de minimis shipments for Chinese goods. A lot of people, not unfairly, think that this presents the opportunity to do an end run around the UFLPA, even though CBP officially says that just because you're de minimis, it doesn't mean that you're not going to get scrutinized. But the reality is there's such a high volume of de minimis shipments that it's very difficult to police everything that comes into the country. And then thirdly, you want to keep, there's a lot of congressional interest in the interest of transshipment, Chinese origin transshipment that's designed to evade the application of the UFLPA. And you see this reflected in the CBP dashboard statistics, where interestingly, 87% of UFLPA detentions do not involve or merchandise this country of origin, China. The UFLPA is about China ostensibly, but the countries of origin where these goods are originating or coming from are places like Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, Mexico. Not surprisingly, I did a lot of work on nearshoring issues, and it's not at all surprising to see, because there's been so much Chinese foreign direct investment in Mexico, to see that now Mexico is a country of origin for of goods that end up getting detained for UFLPA purposes. Third, the development to keep an eye on is there's litigation out there now taking place. The UFLPA has been on the books for about a year, and not surprisingly, we are starting to see some court cases. I'm thinking in particular of the Royal Brush case, which was not technically a UFLPA case, it was an EPA case, but it has implications, and people in the trade community and the trade profession are talking about the implications, the due process implications it has for the UFLPA and an importer's rights to get information from the government, which have not always been crystal clear. There's another case that's in the pipeline now, just entered the pipeline at the Court of International Trade, 9-star. That's still early to know how that will come out, but that basically involves a challenge to a company being placed on the entity list. These cases and the others that will surely follow will add important meat to the bones to the framework which we're operating in, the regulatory framework, as they always do. Finally, the last point, the last development I think importers should keep an eye on is the notion of enhanced targeting capabilities. There have been a number of triggers in the past for identifying forced labor issues in a trade context. Some examples include the risk profiles that are generated via interagency sharing of traditional entry or product information. The government is getting better and better and better about this, as they have new platforms like ACE, well, fairly new, new channels for sharing information, cooperating, whereas in the past they've been more siloed. The e-allegation mechanism is out there. That's always something that importers should keep their eye on. The reports by NGOs can trigger CBP action, even voluntary disclosures on the part of companies involved in trade. Now, at this point, to set of triggers, we need to add artificial intelligence, machine learning, predictive analytics to the mix. The foundation for this really is the 2021 National Artificial Intelligence Initiative and the executive orders and the acts that go along with that. But this is a initiative and an act and a development which has far-reaching implications, in the sense that you're going to see the United States government and all the agencies there within using, as a matter of policy, looking for opportunities to leverage artificial intelligence, machine learning, and predictive analytics in the service of trade compliance and enforcement actions and measures. This is going to deepen the U.S. government's and the private sector's ability to evaluate supply chains and detect or address non-compliance issues across the entire spectrum of federal trade regulation. I was thinking about this when I was preparing my remarks, and when you think about it, I mean, these are just some examples of how and where artificial intelligence could be harnessed in this way. Unfair trade, biothreats, forced labor, environmental protection concerns, financial crimes, anti-money laundering, trafficking of all sorts, IP theft, evasion, circumvention from anti-dumping orders. You could go on and on. This is the future, and I think that the discussion that's going to follow here with the case study, which the BITE team put together, is a prime example of what I'm talking about. With that, I'm going to yield back to Tim and Ann and Eric and everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for taking us through the forced labor enforcement changes. Very important differences that we're seeing more recently. In particular, your discussion of the elimination of the consumptive demand and the rebuttable presumption burden placed on the trade community. So that increases their due diligence responsibilities under the shared responsibility concept. More burden is put on the trade community to prove their commodities are not associated with forced labor, which is a different dynamic than we've seen in other enforcement areas that CBP and Homeland Security investigations focuses on. So this is clearly shown by the statistics you mentioned on the dashboard. 5,000 engagements, not all of them seizures or detentions, but 5,000 is a remarkable number in such a short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So now more than ever, we see a need for an efficient, low-cost screening app to identify supply chain vulnerabilities for forced labor. And toward that end, right now, we're going to ask Ann to walk us through the BITE platform, the Business Intelligence for Trade Enforcement analytic platform, how you can perform screening, how we can automate the due diligence process in that platform. And we're going to provide a use case we think you'll find interesting. Ann?
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. All right, so this is the homepage to the BITE platform, as Tim just said. So as we were talking about commodities being of high importance to this conversation today, we're going to take a look at the trade protection module first. And this module allows users to search for commodities and identify customs or trade-related controls. Specifically to this example, where we've been talking about forced labor-related commodities. So if a commodity comes from or can be made in the XUAR or high-risk area, then that will show up here in the platform. So for this example, I'm going to go ahead and search paprika. And first identify the HS code that I want to use. So this is just the HS code, US HS codes, HTS codes. And I can see down here that it's this 9421 is paprika. And so I can copy that. And then I'm going to go to my regimes and controls and search this HS code, or I could just search paprika. So I will go ahead and search this HS code and see the hits returned and see that this is related to forced labor in XUAR. And so we have a number of different lists, regimes, and controls in here. I'm just going through the forced labor one today, as that's been the topic of conversation, but there are trade-related lists related to anti-dumping, fish and wildlife controls, IWT, and a number of others. Also in here are international lists from the EU and dual use items as well, as can be seen here. So just going back, both Bob and Tim mentioned the need to screen for entities as well. So available free in the app is the watch list. So this is kind of a first stop for due diligence. It allows anyone to quickly look up names to determine if they're on any global watch lists and which agencies have listed them. So your single query runs across all the watch list, so it hits on over 47,000 records, And by reviewing the entities in your supply chain, and as Bob mentioned, and checking them against this watch list, you can begin to show additional due diligence and compliance with US sanctions and regulations. So for here, we could search Hoshine, which is on the UFLPA, and see the entities listed. And we can see here that it's both listed by BIS and DHS. So we can begin to see those entities appearing here. The byte list is a module that contains a curated list of entities. And so this is an additional layer of due diligence. It's a searchable list, again, like the byte list or like the watch list, excuse me. And these are entities associated with high risk trade, and it provides companies with enhanced screening. So within this, we have the byte list, and we also have politically exposed persons. So the byte list, you can search any supplier in your supply chain. So for example, if I was importing from India and I wanted to search an entity in my supply chain, I can return main Cancor, which it appears on the byte list, and it says that it's associated with forced labor. And we see here that it's confirmed receiving commodities from an entity associated with forced labor in XUAR. As a next step, I would just, as I'm exploring this, might want to run that entity specifically on the byte list. And I can see that there are a number of entities here associated with Chenguang. And then I could also then return and check to see if they are on the any of the consolidated watch lists that we have in the watch list module. So again, this is just an additional layer of due diligence. And now I'd like to walk you through how these entities here ended up on the byte list as a use case. So Eric, if you want to go ahead and show the schematic now, then we can jump there and walk through that use case. Great, thanks. So as Eric mentioned at the beginning, the Byte platform is two parts. So we have the web app that I just showed, and then we also have an AI analytical platform. So using the analytical platform, we were able to trace commodities moving from XUAR to India and subsequently into the US. So the center of this schematic here is Chenguang, which I was just showing on the Byte list, and open source research conducted by a number of NGOs indicated that Chenguang was associated with forced labor in XUAR. Upon analysis in Byte, the Byte team decided to focus on its trade with Indian entities specifically, and this showed 131 transactions to 15 Indian consignees, and the total declared value of these shipments was over $55 million. The 8 entities in green on this schematic here are Indian companies that we saw importing a product from Chenguang and then subsequently shipping a variation of the same product to the United States. So for example, we can see main Cancor up near the top importing oleoresin paprika crude from China, and then subsequently that being exported to the US. So we are not saying that all bulk shipments from Chenguang are incorporated into the Indian products that are shipped to the US, but it does suggest a direct supply line for products shipped from XUAR that are then processed in India and imported into the US to some major companies, including some Fortune 500 companies. So this type of analysis is also available as a service that we can provide, and we can also provide the in-depth report behind this schematic as well to anyone who is interested. So we can reach out and we can talk about how you could access the data behind this schematic. So this again is just to demonstrate, I think as both Tim and Bob said, that there is a higher risk associated with US companies trading with foreign suppliers who then may be transacting with entities who are engaged in forced labor. So that is the use case in the product demo. I know, Eric, you're collecting questions in the question box, but if you want, I can go right into product updates. I know we're a little over time.
Yeah, that's fine, Ann. We can go straight into the product updates.
Okay, great. I quickly went through the app, but the three modules that we looked at were the watch list, the bite list, and the trade protection. So in addition to the lists that are already in the app that are being regularly updated, some are updated even hourly. We are constantly adding additional lists into the app for increased screening capabilities. So we've added recently the Lithuanian financial crime financial sanctions list, and then also Ukraine's international sponsors of war. So those are both available through the BITE watch list module. The BITE list, we've added 50,000 entities that are operating in XUAR. And so though that adds an additional kind of, like I said, screening layer. And then also as we call through and as our analytical platform calls through the data that we have, we continue to add associated entities with forced labor that may not be operating in XUAR, but have those connections like we saw in the Indian spice example. And then finally, the trade protection, the commodities-based lists, we are regularly adding to those, and soon we'll have an exciting commodities-related forced labor list that we will be talking about in the upcoming weeks, but that I demonstrated part of today by looking at paprika and the connection to forced labor. So those are our exciting product updates this month. We will, like, as I said, we are continuing to update them. So as new lists come out, such as the Netherlands has a new list coming out related to semiconductors next month, all of those are regularly updated in the app. And that's all I have for you, Eric.
Thanks, Ann. So we're running a little behind today, a little short on time. So we're not going to go through the trade enforcement roundup, but if you do want to take a look at what we have, this is the card that we've created, and you can find it on our website, our social media, and we do this monthly. So please feel free to join our newsletter, our mailing list, and you will get these pieces through that. So I want to move on to the Q&A portion of our call. We do have a question in the chat right now. If you have any other questions, please, for us or for Bob, please feel free to send me a message, and we will go through those. So our first question is from Randy Wynn. I believe it's for Bob. And his question is, are de minimis shipments things like orders from sites like Temu that appear to provide one-off purchases from foreign firms?
Yes, de minimis, can you, yeah, I'm unmuted here.
Yeah, we can hear you.
De minimis refers to shipments under Section 321 that are have a value, an entered value of less than $800. They can be done by one person, one time per day. So this is not a high volume thing. This is not importing in bulk. These are those low value, high volume, from the government's perspective, shipments.
Thank you, Bob. I'll give everyone another few seconds to add any other questions that they may have. It looks like we have a question from Nate. Can you explain how, I believe this is for Ann and Tim, can you explain how the app traps business relationships within China and then cross-border? I'm curious about the kinds of data available outside of China.
How it traps business relationships in China. We use open source registries and things like that to populate the indexes for the companies. In this example, we're particularly focused on the XUAR, but we have another group of lists that pertain to strategic trade controls. So might be companies associated with counterproliferation violations, military civil fusion program in China. And then we will take our manifest data, which Ann went through. We have, I think we're up to 750 million, and we will essentially cross-reference those companies and entities against the manifest data to identify higher risk shipments. And that's what we did in this use case we showed today, was to cross-reference the manifest data for India against the XUAR entities. And then we could see a pattern of a number of companies in India receiving from that Chinese entity associated with forced labor, if that answers your question.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Nate. So this question is for Bob from Jay Decker. Is there a difference between the terms forced labor and modern day slavery? Is the latter just a media term? Which term should professionals use?
Forced labor, compulsory labor were the terms. I mean, I'm a lawyer. I'm going to key always to what I see in the regulations and the laws, and what you see there is at least in section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930 is the references to forced or compulsory labor, or child labor is referenced as well.
Thank you, Bob. Any other questions? Give everyone a second. Okay, well, thank you again for everyone for joining us. If you're interested in learning more about the Byte platform, please feel free to visit our website. It's bytedata.io. I will throw that into the chat for everyone. Thank you again for joining us. If you do have any additional questions or want to reach out, you can reach out to us at byte@newborders.com. I'll put that in the chat as well. And we try and do these conversations monthly, so feel free to follow our LinkedIn, our social media, and to get the newest updates from us. Thank you again, Bob, for joining us. We really appreciate it, and to all of our speakers, thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Eric.